Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So let's start. My name is Matija Dujmović, and today I will be talking about Spring HATEOAS hypermedia-driven web services and clients that understand them. Now, I know the title is a mouthful, but I promise this will be a simple presentation, and I know it's late and you're pretty tired. So before I start the presentation, I want to ask the audience, how many of you have developed REST services? Okay, so pretty much everyone. And how many of you have developed those services with hypermedia? Okay, so one person. You'll already know all of this then. So, I made this presentation because I noticed that a lot of developers don't understand hypermedia and HATEOAS, me being one of them, before I started to investigate what HATEOAS actually does. And I'll try to explain that to you in the most simple terms I can today. Before I get to HATEOAS, I want to get to the inspiration of hypermedia-driven web services. So where did it all start? With the largest and oldest web application in the history of the world, the World Wide Web. To simplify how the web works, it's made of three key components. The URI, which is a location of the resource we want to retrieve. We're using HTTP methods to retrieve that resource, and the resource itself needs some representation. In this case, most of the time it will be HTML. Now, taking this as an excellent example of using the web's architecture, hypermedia APIs try to emulate. So again, they use a URI that uniquely identifies a resource. They use HTTP methods for retrieval and manipulation of these resources. And finally, they use a hypermedia type. Now, when you said that you created REST services, you probably meant that you used JSON as a resource media type. But is JSON a hypermedia type? Well, no. And why is that? Because to answer that question, let's take a look at what being a hypermedia type is. So you take any old regular media type or MIME type, and you give it hyperlink support, and you end up with a hypermedia type. Now, we'll get to some concrete implementations of hypermedia types, but I want to take you through a quick history lesson of how we came to the need for hypermedia APIs. In the beginning, we had static HTML. And I'm going to try to explain this little arrow over here, what happened. So, in the old days, with static HTML, when you worked with resources, to retrieve them, you used links. And when you needed to manipulate a resource or communicate with your web application, you used forms. Now, these forms had some information in them. So, okay, the action where this form will post is this URI. The parameters are required. They're also named. So, static HTML was good for a while. We were all pretty happy how it worked. But then came mobile phones. We needed mobile web pages. We needed native applications that used our backend. And thus came the need for a more flexible backend. And we started using JSON-based CRUD APIs. Now, this is the most common usage of REST web services, where you have an endpoint that gives you some data. And it's pretty much self-explanatory here. But how did we get from all this to just this? We lost a lot of data here. So without the links and forms, we're missing some crucial metadata about how our backend works. And this leads to the need for developers to read the documentation, to understand how the API works, and to adapt the client to the API. By doing this, every time the API changes, each one of your clients needs to adapt to the new API. This leads to breaking changes and mandatory redeploys. So, here comes hypermedia with link support. And it's all about the links and forms with hypermedia. So, hypermedia and the links in it try to restore the metadata we lost when we switched from static HTML to JSON-based CRUD APIs. And this metadata can be grouped into 3 types. The objects metadata. This is the metadata that you take for granted in strongly typed languages such as Java. So you have a property with a value, but you don't know what type that property is. So we want to define the properties with this objects metadata. For example, here's a reading from my smart hygrostat that I use at home, and it's giving me a value of the property humidity status over. Now, what is the type of this property? I don't know. The objects metadata will tell me. It will say it's a string, it's an enum, or etc. Now next, we have address metadata. So where is our resource located? From that simple JSON I showed you a few slides earlier, you don't know where it came from. You just know the data in that JSON. So the addresses are here to tell you this resource is located here. Similar resources are located at these URIs. And finally, we have actions metadata. You can think of the actions metadata as the form data we lost. So with this metadata, your client should be able to build a functioning form and work with your API with no additional knowledge of the documentation or the resource outside of your API. Okay, so that's the end of the short history lesson. Let's start using hypermedia. But to use hypermedia, we need to first choose a hypermedia type. Here's a list of the most popular hypermedia types in use today, but we'll be concentrating on HAL and its extension HAL forms. So HAL is a JSON-based hypermedia type, and it's currently in use as the default media type in Spring Data REST and in Amazon Web Services. If you've ever used them, HAL will be the default media type out of the box. So it has a pretty big usage already. HAL stands for Hypermedia Application Language, and it supports only one type of metadata, and it's the addresses metadata. So, how does this work? It's done through a links hash. That's just a special name for a property that HAL defines. And now we'll see how it differs from a standard old JSON file. So here we have the JSON file with 2 properties defined and nothing more. This is the HAL equivalent. So we've defined the links hash, which defines 2 properties. The self link, which leads to the resource itself. So that's what I called. And we get another link pointing to all other resources of this type. So in just this one fetch of our resource, we have a lot more information than we had with plain old JSON. Now, this is a single resource, and we'll take a look at a collection of resources next. So again, we have an array of JSON files in a regular old JSON, but with HAL, we have a links property, and here's a semi-custom implementation where I decided to implement my pagination in my API directly. So my client just needs to use the links I provided directly from my API, and it can traverse my resources in an efficient manner that I officially propose from my API. Now, when working with collections of HAL files, you'll also notice the embedded hash. So the embedded hash occurs only in collections of resources, and it basically just contains a list of the resources, and each element of that list is a unique HAL file. So what you just saw earlier, each file in the list isn't just an anonymous element, it's an identified element with multiple links possible to be defined. Well, that covers HAL, but I said I would be going through HAL forms. Now, what HAL forms offers is the actions metadata. It extends HAL, and it offers the actions metadata. It's supported by the Affordances API, which is a new API in the Spring HATEOAS library. And I need to make a small disclaimer. The Affordances API is still only available in snapshot builds. So it's not a production-ready implementation. But let's take a look how HAL forms implements the actions metadata. So, a regular JSON and the HAL forms metadata. Now you'll notice it includes the links from the HAL file from before, but now it also has a templates hash, which defines all of the possible methods that can be executed on that resource. So on this endpoint, I can execute a put and a delete. I've also defined all the properties that I need to define to be able to call these methods. In this case, if I want to update this resource, I need to provide an email and a name. So you'll notice these values and properties are very similar to the attributes that we had in a form, that we had in static HTML. Now going forward to a collection, again, we have the templates hash and the two old hashes from HAL. And the templates now define everything we can do on this route. In this case, it's a post. Again, defining all the properties that need to be defined to be a valid call of the post method. Okay, that's enough about talking about hypermedia. Let's sum up what HATEOAS is. So it's not a breakfast cereal. HATEOAS is a pretty bad acronym, at least to me, because it doesn't tell you a lot. It stands for hypermedia as the engine of application state. But to simplify this, in layman's terms, it just means using resource metadata, supporting evolvable API interactions, and avoiding tight coupling between your API and client. So by providing your clients with resource metadata, you're removing the need for your clients to store heavy logic that only your API should be taking care of. Now, the library that supports all these interactions is called Spring HATEOAS. And to use it, you basically need to add a configuration annotation saying that you're enabling hypermedia support in your REST controllers, and that you're defining the hypermedia type you're using, in this case, HAL forms. And we need to use the link builder interface. I won't be going into detail about this. Basically, all of your resources need to be wrapped in special classes before sending them to the clients, and you need to use special methods for the links hash and the templates hash. In practice, it looks something like this. Now, I won't concentrate on the implementation. There are multiple tutorials that go through this part. What I'm going to do is show you a short demo how this can benefit your development. So what I have here is a very minimalistic web application, which is basically an API and a JavaScript front end. So it's not a framework, it's just one file and some bootstrap. All in all, it has 140 lines of code. And the purpose of this application is to showcase how your client's interactions with your API can benefit from HATEOAS. So, by refreshing, what happened here is I called the get method on the root of my API. And this is an unwritten rule of hypermedia APIs. It says that to understand your API, the only thing you need to know is the root of the API and call it with a get method. Now this will return all of the available links in your application, basically all of the links in your API. And in this case, it's just 2 links. So the root link I defined and the attendance resource. What happens next is I'm using the attendance link to call it with get and see what it can offer me. And that's the links and templates hash. So I can see that to create a new attendant, I need to call the post method and use a name and an email. And both of these are required. I can of course modify this on my API to say you don't need to enter an email. Okay, so let's enter something. Oh, just one more thing. So by using the templates hash, this is the form I generated and injected to my client. Because if we take a look at my client, the HTML is empty. So this whole form you're seeing here is generated exclusively from the data my API provided to my client and injected it. That's the form that was created. Now we're going to use that form to create a new resource. So I'm registering a new attendant, and what happened is we called options. Okay, that's automatical with Spring HATEOAS. Next is we posted. So we posted what was entered to the form, and the response told us where our newly created resource is located. By using the location header, I'm using the get call and retrieving the information that I just entered. So all of this is happening just by using the framework of the web. No additional implementation from my client. But maybe you're saying this doesn't look too impressive. What's the big deal? Well, let's say you have changing demands from your users. They now need to enter a OIB. And just by changing my model and restarting the backend with my API, so I've added a new property called OIB and updated the constructor. Going back to my client, it simply works just by using the data from my API. Okay, just to test it out, so you don't think I'm faking it. Indeed, it's working. So I posted this data using the OIB, and my backend has retrieved that data Now, this was a, sorry. Sorry. So this was a simple demonstration how changing your API and using HATEOAS can make your thin clients work smartly with your heavy API. Now, I just showed you how some fields need to be mandatory by sending back the required field, but here's a possibility. You can expose complex validations to your clients. For example, the OIB I just entered. It could be more complex. For example, defining the prompt the user sees, and even defining the regular expression that this input requires. So in the future, you can basically control everything your clients need to enter. You don't need to redeploy your clients. You don't need to announce downtime. You just need a load balancer and switch to the new API. All of your clients should automatically work with HATEOAS. Now, to conclude, HATEOAS is good for you if you have multiple clients or you're just trying to avoid tight coupling. It's not for each and every case you have. If you want to learn more about HATEOAS and hypermedia APIs and clients, the books by Mike Amundsen are pretty great. The accompanying GitHub repos are also a godsend. And that's that. Are there any questions? So everybody understood what I said. That's great. Okay, so the question was, when you send back a regular expression to your client, how can it be used in a form? Okay, that's the part where you need your JavaScript client to smartly take in the metadata you sent and use it to build forms. I showed you how I generated that form in the console. Well, the same way. You use JavaScript's built-in add attribute method, and you add a regular expression there. Sorry, was there a question? Okay. Any more questions? That's my custom code in the small JavaScript file. So I wrote a pretty basic HATEOAS parser, how you could call it, that uses the metadata that gets sent back, and then I use it to inject HTML. Now there are multiple libraries already available for Angular or React that use that can take in the data sent in HAL form. So you can do that immediately. HAL forms is still in experimental phase, so it's still in snapshot builds and it's not widely adopted, but HAL already is available in multiple adapters as a media type. If that's all the questions, thank you for your time.